Hey guys, and welcome back to Born in the Past. If you enjoy these journeys into the strange and often mysterious corners of history, please consider taking a moment to subscribe. It's a simple click that costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference for the channel and allows these stories to continue. Tonight, we are traveling back in time to the golden sands and the shimmering sun of the ancient world's most iconic and enduring civilization. We are going to the land of the pharaohs, of towering pyramids and silent, watchful gods. But we are not here tonight to read hieroglyphs from a tomb wall or to unwrap the mysteries of a mummy. We are embarking on a much more intimate journey. We are here to answer a simple, fundamental question. What did you actually eat in ancient Egypt? When we think of the food of ancient Egypt, our minds often drift to images of pure, decadent luxury. We picture a languid Cleopatra, being fed peeled grapes by a servant. We imagine grand, overflowing banquets in the halls of a pharaoh, with tables laden with roasted ducks, mountains of exotic fruits, and chalices of fine wine. We think of a land of milk and honey, a place of effortless abundance, and for a tiny, infinitesimally small fraction of the population, for the gods on earth and their high priests, that wasn't entirely wrong. But for the other 99% of the people who lived and died along the banks of the Nile, that vision is a beautiful fantasy. Their reality was not one of luxury, but of hard, repetitive, back-breaking labor, in service to the two great forces that governed their world: the pharaoh, who was their living god, and the Nile, the river that was their source of all life. And to understand what they ate, you must first understand this great river. The Nile was not just a river. It was the central character in the story of Egypt. It was their clock, their calendar, and their creator. The historian Herodotus famously said, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile," and he was not exaggerating. In a world surrounded by the vast, lifeless deserts of the Red Land, the valley of the Nile was a thin, green, fertile miracle. And this miracle was delivered on a schedule. Every year, like clockwork, the great river would swell with the rains from the heart of Africa and overflow its banks, flooding the surrounding valley. This was the season of Akhet, the inundation. For several months, the entire world would be a great, placid lake. Then, just as predictably, the waters would recede, leaving behind a thick, rich, and incredibly fertile layer of black silt. This was Kemet, the Black Land, from which Egypt got its ancient name. This was the season of Peret, the growing time, when farmers would rush to plow this new, damp earth and sow their seeds. Finally came Shamu, the long, dry season of harvest, when the sun would beat down and bake the earth, and the people would gather the bounty that the river's gift had provided. This predictable, reliable cycle was the engine of their civilization. While other ancient peoples were at the mercy of unpredictable rainfall and devastating droughts, the Egyptians had the most reliable agricultural system in the world. This reliability allowed them to produce massive surpluses of food, enough to feed a large population, support a standing army, and, of course, to build the pyramids. But a surplus of food did not mean a surplus of variety. The Nile was the world's most dependable and perhaps its least imaginative chef. Every year, it served up the exact same menu, based on a handful of hearty, reliable ingredients. So the story of Egyptian food is a story of two realities, born from the same black soil. It is the story of the farmer, whose life was a testament to the fact that you could live in a land of plenty and still eat the same bland meal every single day. His diet was a lesson in monotony, a cycle of bread and beer designed as fuel for a life of labor. And it is the story of the noble, the priest, and the pharaoh, whose diet was a reflection of their divine status. Theirs was a world of abundance, of roasted meats, of sweet fruits, of fine wines and honeyed cakes, all the bounty that the labor of the common man produced. To truly understand what you would eat in ancient Egypt, You must first ask yourself a simple question. In the great, rigid pyramid of this ancient society, who were you? Were you the man who toiled in the mud to grow the grain? Or were you the God King for whom that grain was grown? Your answer would determine everything. It would determine if you ate to live or if you lived to eat in preparation for an even grander feast in the afterlife. The answer to the question, who were you, determines which of two very different kitchens you would call your own. In the rigidly structured world of ancient Egypt, there was very little middle ground. There was the kitchen of the peasant, a place of smoke, earth, and survival. And there was the kitchen of the priest and the pharaoh, a place of sacred abundance and culinary bureaucracy. These were two separate nations of food, coexisting in the same fertile valley, and the chasm between them was as wide and as deep as the Nile itself. First, let us step into the home of the peasant, the farmer whose labor is the engine of the entire civilization. His kitchen is not a separate room. It is a designated corner of the same one-room mud brick hut where his family sleeps, is born, and will eventually die. The floor is packed earth. The air is thick with a perpetual, hazy smoke from the open hearth, a simple clay-lined pit on the floor where a fire of dried reeds or animal dung smolders. His cooking equipment is sparse and functional. A few rough handmade clay pots for boiling and storage, a flat stone for baking bread, and most importantly, a heavy saddle quern, two stones used for the back-breaking daily task of grinding grain. The philosophy of this kitchen is one of brutal efficiency. The guiding principle is not flavor, not variety, not pleasure. It is a single, relentless question. How can I turn the raw grain from my small plot of land into the maximum number of edible calories using the absolute minimum of precious fuel? There is no concept of cuisine here. There is no joy in the art of cooking. There is only the grim, repetitive alchemy of turning grain into fuel, so that the human body can perform the labor required to produce more grain. It is a closed, exhausting loop. The food they eat is a direct reflection of the life they lead. Monotonous, tough, but ultimately life-sustaining. Now let us travel from the humble hut to the sprawling temple complex of a great god like Amun-Ra, or to the palace of the pharaoh himself. Here, the kitchen is not a smoky corner. It is a vast, bustling, and highly organized food production facility. It is a complex of separate buildings and open courtyards, a hive of activity employing dozens, sometimes hundreds, of specialized workers. There is a bakery with a battery of tall, conical bread ovens turning out hundreds of loaves a day in dozens of different shapes and sizes. There is a butchery where prized oxen, fattened on the temple's own lands, are slaughtered for the god's table. There is a brewery producing multiple grades of beer, from the everyday stuff for the workers to a high-quality brew fit for a divine offering. The philosophy of this kitchen is one of ritualized abundance. The food prepared here has a purpose that transcends mere sustenance. Its primary customer is the god himself. Every day, the priest must prepare an elaborate, multi-course meal to be placed before the statue of the god in the temple's inner sanctum. This food must be the best of the best. The whitest flour, the fattest geese, the most perfect cuts of meat, the sweetest fruits, the finest wine. Purity is paramount. The cooks and butchers are not just laborers. They are participants in a sacred ritual. Their work is a form of worship. Of course, the god does not actually consume the meal after it has been ritually offered and the god has absorbed its spiritual essence. The food reverts to the temple staff. The high priests and their families get the choicest cuts, and the rest is distributed down the hierarchy. The temple, therefore, ran the most exclusive high-end restaurant in all of Egypt, with a divine tasting menu and a client who never complained. So we have our two kitchens. One is a minimalist, open-plan space focused on a single core function, survival. The other is a massive, professional operation with different departments, a large staff, and a focus on ritual and quality control. But the most important thing to remember is that the incredible abundance of the second kitchen was only made possible by the monotonous subsistence of the first. The peasants' labor produced the grain that fed the temple's bakers and brewers. The peasants' taxes, paid in livestock, supplied the temple's butchers. The entire Egyptian economy was, in essence, a massive food delivery service where 95% of the people were the farmers and drivers, and the top 5% were the only ones who ever got to see the full menu. Our journey into the Egyptian diet will explore these two menus side by side, but we must begin with the one food that in different forms appeared on both tables every single day. The food that was not just a staple, but the very definition of life itself. We begin with bread. While the kitchens of the peasant and the priest were worlds apart in their scale and their philosophy, they were both built on the same simple, unshakable foundation. They both knelt at the altar of the same two sibling gods, bread and beer. These were not just staples, they were the pillars of Egyptian civilization. But bread was first among equals. In ancient Egypt, bread was not just something you ate. It was a form of payment, a religious offering, a symbol of life itself. The Egyptian word for bread, ta, was synonymous with sustenance, and the phrase bread and beer was used as a general greeting, a way of saying all is well. To understand their bread, you must first understand their grain. The Egyptians were masters of cultivating two incredibly hardy and reliable cereals, gifts perfectly suited to the Nile Valley. The first, and most important for baking, was emmer wheat. This was not the soft, pliable bread wheat we know today. Emmer is an ancient, tough-husked grain. Its kernels are protected by a rugged outer shell that does not come off easily during threshing. This tough husk made it more resistant to pests and spoilage in storage, but it also meant that processing it into flour was an incredibly laborious task, a fact that will become painfully relevant later. The second great grain was barley. Barley was even tougher than emmer, able to thrive in poorer soil and with less water, making it a reliable backup crop. While it was also used to make a dense, heavy bread, its primary role was in the production of Egypt's other great staple, beer. From these two grains, the Egyptians, particularly those in the temple and palace bakeries, produced a truly astonishing variety of bread, tomb paintings, and more importantly, actual preserved food offerings found in those tombs show a baker's catalog that would put a modern artisanal bakery to shame. There were at least 40 different types of bread and cakes, each with its own name and purpose. They baked bread in countless different shapes: small, round, flat loaves like modern pita, tall, conical loaves that were baked in special clay molds, triangular loaves, braided loaves, and even loaves shaped like animals, human figures, or divine symbols for specific religious rituals. For the wealthy, bread could be a luxury item, enriched with other precious ingredients. Bakers would add honey or the sweet pulp of dates and figs to create bread that blurred the line between a staple and a dessert. They might use milk instead of water to create a richer dough, or add seeds, nuts, or spices to create more complex flavors. This was the haute cuisine of the Egyptian bakery, a world away from the simple, functional loaf of the common farmer. But the importance of bread went far beyond the dinner table. It was the backbone of the entire Egyptian economy. In a world largely without coinage, bread was currency. The massive workforce required to build the pyramids, temples, and tombs was not paid in gold or silver. They were paid their daily wages in standardized rations of bread and beer. We know from detailed records found at sites like Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, that a standard worker received a daily wage of several loaves of bread and a couple of jugs of beer. Your weekly paycheck wasn't a slip of paper. It was a pile of several hundred loaves of bread. It was a compensation package you could eat. Bread was also the most common offering to the gods. The temple bakeries were massive, state-run operations, churning out thousands of loaves a day, not for human consumption, but for the divine table. Every morning, priests would carry trays piled high with fresh, warm, and often elaborately shaped bread into the temple's sanctuary and place them before the statue of the god. The hieroglyph for offering is a picture of a loaf of bread sitting on a reed mat. For the Egyptians, to give an offering was fundamentally to give bread. This divine connection was no accident. The entire process of growing grain was a powerful symbol of their most important myth, the story of the god Osiris, who was killed, dismembered, and then resurrected. The grain, which died when it was planted in the earth, was then reborn as a green shoot and finally harvested to give life to mankind, was a direct, edible parallel to this cycle of death and rebirth. Bread, therefore, was not just sustenance for the body. It was a symbol of eternal life itself. It was the sun around which the entire Egyptian culinary and economic world revolved. It was the fuel of the laborer, the wealth of the state, and the food of the gods. Its form might change, from the simple gritty flatbread of a farmer to the honey-sweetened, ox-shaped loaf on a temple altar. But its central importance never did. But this divine staple, this edible symbol of life, did not appear by magic. It was born from some of the most punishing, monotonous, and back-breaking labor imaginable. Bread may have been a symbol of life and divinity, a currency of the state, and the food of the gods, but its own birth into the world was anything but divine. It was a product of sweat, dust, pain, and some of the most monotonous and physically punishing labor in the ancient world. Before a single loaf could be offered on a temple altar or eaten by a hungry farmer, it had to be forced into existence through a series of brutal, exhausting steps. The journey began after the harvest, on the hard, sun-baked threshing floor. The air would be thick with golden dust and the dry smell of cut grain. Here, the first task was to separate the valuable kernels from the stalks and husks. This was often done with the help of oxen, their heavy hooves treading in endless circles over the piles of wheat or barley, breaking the grain heads open. Or it was done by hand, with teams of laborers beating the stalks rhythmically with wooden flails, a dusty and strenuous task that went on for days under the hot Egyptian sun. Once the grain was threshed, it had to be winnowed. Women would stand with large, flat baskets, tossing the mixture of grain and chaff into the air. The wind, a welcome partner in this stage, would carry away the lighter, useless chaff, while the heavier, precious grain kernels would fall back into the basket. It was a graceful, almost beautiful process to watch, but it was still painstaking, repetitive work. But all of that was just a prelude to the true ordeal. The most grueling, soul-destroying, and physically debilitating task of all was the grinding of the grain into flour. And this job, this cornerstone of the entire food supply, fell almost exclusively to women. You must forget the image of a picturesque watermill or a windmill grinding flour effortlessly. For the average Egyptian household, the primary piece of food processing technology was the saddle quern. This was a simple, primitive, and brutal tool. It consisted of a large, slightly concave stationary stone, the quern, and a smaller, loaf-shaped rubbing stone that the user would hold in their hands. To make flour, a woman would have to kneel on the ground before the quern, often for hours at a time, every single day. Imagine the posture. You are kneeling, your toes curled underneath you for leverage, a position that puts immense strain on your feet. You are leaning forward over the stone, your back bent at an agonizing angle. You hold the smaller stone in both hands, and with the full force of your body weight, you push it forward, crushing the tough emmer wheat kernels against the stone below. Then you pull it back. Then you push it forward again, over and over and over. The motion is repetitive, exhausting, and ergonomically catastrophic. It is a full-body workout designed by a tyrant. We know just how agonizing this was because the Egyptians have told us through their own bodies. Skeletal remains of ordinary Egyptian women show a specific and consistent pattern of wear and tear. They have flattened and damaged toe bones from a lifetime of kneeling. They have severe chronic arthritis in their lower backs and knees. Their vertebrae are often compressed and damaged. Their bodies are a silent testament to the daily torture of the saddle quern. Forget a high-end stand mixer with a dough hook. Their primary kitchen appliance was a lifetime of agonizing, degenerative joint disease. And as you kneel there, your back screaming in protest, you watch as a fine dust of stone from the quern itself mixes in with the flour you are so painstakingly producing. There is nothing you can do about it. This grit will end up in the bread. You know that every loaf you bake will be a small dental demolition project, slowly but surely sanding down the teeth of your own family. But you have no choice. This is the only way. Once the flour was finally ground, it had to be baked. For a peasant family, this often meant creating simple unleavened flatbreads, mixing the coarse, gritty flour with water and maybe some sourdough starter, and baking them on a hot stone or directly in the ashes of the hearth fire. In the larger, more organized bakeries of the temples and the elite, they used tall conical clay molds. The dough would be slapped onto the inside of the hot mold, which was then placed in a large open oven, resulting in the distinctive cone-shaped loaves that are so common in offering scenes. So when you see the beautiful depictions of bread in Egyptian art, or the miraculously preserved loaves left in tombs, remember the hidden reality. Every single one of those loaves was born of pain. It was infused with the sweat of the threshers, the dust of the winnowers, and the quiet, chronic agony of the woman who spent her life kneeling at the grinding stone. The bread was life, but the making of it was a life sentence. The story of bread, born from the dust of the grinding stone and the sweat of the women who knelt there, is only half of the great nutritional story of ancient Egypt. Every loaf had a liquid twin, a constant companion that was just as essential to daily life, to the economy, and to the very soul of their civilization. This was not water. This was not wine. This was henket. This was beer. But when you hear the word beer, you must immediately erase the modern image of a cold, clear, fizzy, golden pilsner served in a frosted glass. Egyptian beer was something else entirely. It was thick, it was cloudy, it was nutritious, and it was, fundamentally, a form of liquid bread. It was less a refreshing beverage and more a drinkable, slightly alcoholic, fermented porridge. For the ancient Egyptians, bread and beer were not just two separate items on a menu. They were two sides of the same coin, the twin pillars upon which their entire society was built. Beer was, first and foremost, a solution to a critical public health problem: unsafe drinking water. The Egyptians, like the medieval Europeans thousands of years later, knew from experience that people who drank water directly from the Nile or from canals often got violently ill with dysentery and other diseases. They didn't know about germ theory, but they knew that beer was safe. The process of brewing, which involved boiling the initial ingredients and then allowing fermentation to occur, effectively sterilize the liquid, killing off most of the dangerous pathogens. Beer was hydration you could trust, but it was so much more than that. It was a primary source of nutrition. Made from barley or emmer wheat, it was packed with calories, carbohydrates, and essential nutrients like B vitamins from the yeast. For the laborers who built the pyramids, a few jugs of beer a day was not an indulgence. It was a vital part of their daily energy intake, a way to refuel their bodies for the grueling work of hauling massive stone blocks under the hot sun. This is why beer, along with bread, was the official currency of the state. The pharaoh's government paid its massive workforce of builders, soldiers, and civil servants in rations of food and drink. Detailed records show that a typical laborer on a state project was entitled to a daily wage of 10 loaves of bread and 1 to 2 jugs of beer, which could be up to 4 liters. Imagine getting your weekly paycheck, not in cash, but as a small mountain of bread and a sloshing. Heavy delivery of beer jugs. It was a compensation package that was also your lunch. So how was this miraculous, life-sustaining liquid bread actually made? The process was a fascinating piece of ancient alchemy, and it began, naturally, with bread. Egyptian brewers would first bake a special beer bread, usually from barley. This loaf was different from eating bread. It was only lightly baked, so the inside remained moist and uncooked, which preserved the yeast enzymes necessary for fermentation. It was also often sweetened with dates or date juice, the sugar providing a kickstart for the yeast to begin its work. Once the beer bread was ready, it would be crumbled up and dropped into a large clay vat filled with water. The mixture would be stirred into a thick, soupy mash, and then they would wait. They relied on wild yeasts present on the grain and in the air to begin the process of fermentation. The vat would soon begin to bubble and froth as the yeast consumed the sugars and converted them into alcohol. After a few days, when the bubbling had subsided, the fermentation was complete. The final stage was to strain this thick, lumpy mash through a sieve or a piece of cloth to separate the liquid beer from the solid dregs. The resulting liquid was the beer. It would not have been clear or sparkling. It would have been a thick, opaque, milky-looking beverage with a low alcohol content, probably around 2 to 3%. The taste was likely slightly sweet from the dates, a little sour from the wild fermentation, and with the unmistakable earthy flavor of wet bread. This was the drink that fueled a civilization. It was their safe water, their liquid lunch, and their daily wage. Stronger, more refined, and higher alcohol beers certainly existed for festivals and for the tables of the rich. But this thick, soupy, life-giving brew was the true beer of Egypt. To drink a mug of it was not an act of leisure. It was an act of survival, a taste of civilization itself. So beer was the great liquid asset of the Egyptian state, the drinkable, edible currency that fueled its grandest projects. But what was it actually like to receive and consume your daily pay in this form? We must imagine a world where the line between compensation and consumption, between your salary and your supper, was completely erased. The taste of your wage was a literal, physical taste in your mouth every single day. Let's imagine you are a worker on a temple construction site. At the end of a long, grueling day of hauling stone blocks under the relentless sun, you do not receive a small pouch of coins. Instead, you line up before the state scribe, who consults his papyrus records and meticulously checks off your name. Beside him are massive clay jars, filled with the day's production from the state-run brewery. A foreman ladles out your allotted portion, perhaps 2 large jugs containing several liters of the thick, soupy liquid. This, along with a stack of 10 or so dense, heavy loaves of bread, is your payment. There is no negotiation. There is no overtime pay. This is the set rate. This is what your life's labor is worth. Your commute home would have been a logistical challenge. You are carrying not a light wallet, but a heavy, sloshing, and fragile ceramic jug of your daily earnings, along with a hefty pile of bread. Getting paid was a physical workout in itself. Once you returned to your small mud brick home, this beer was not a recreational beverage for relaxing after a long day. It was a core component of the evening meal. You would not crack open a cold one. You would pour a cup of lukewarm, cloudy, and slightly sour beer. As we've established, this was not a light, crisp lager. It was a beverage with body. It was thick with yeast and suspended grain particles, giving it the consistency of a thin gruel. It was food. To drink it was to feel a satisfying weight in your stomach, a replenishment of the calories you had burned. The taste would be utterly alien to a modern beer drinker. Hops, which provide the bitter aromatic flavor we associate with beer today, were not used in Egyptian brewing. The flavor profile came from the grain itself, the earthy taste of barley or emmer, and from the fermentation. With the addition of date juice to many brews, there would have been a distinct sweetness, but this would be balanced by a sour, tangy note from the wild yeasts. Similar to a modern sour beer or a Belgian lambic, but without the crisp carbonation. It was a complex, bready, and deeply functional flavor. And it was not a solitary pleasure. It was the center of the family's evening. You would share your jugs of beer with your wife and children. For them, too, it was a vital source of calories and nutrients, and a much safer alternative to the questionable water from the local canal. For a child, a cup of this weak beer would be the equivalent of a modern fortified drink, a way of getting vitamins and hydration in one go. Forget a glass of milk before bed. A medieval Egyptian child was more likely to have a small cup of beer. Of course, the state knew exactly what it was doing. Paying workers in bread and beer was a brilliant system of control. These were perishable goods. You could not hoard your wages for months to save up for a major purchase. The bread would go stale, and the beer would turn to vinegar. Your wage had to be consumed almost immediately. This ensured that you, the worker, remained in a state of perpetual dependence on your employer, the state. You could never get ahead. You could only get by day on the rations you were given. This system also prevented the growth of a free market for labor. You couldn't take your wages and spend them at a different shop or tavern. You were given the state's bread and the state's beer. There was no choice. This created a closed-loop economy where the pharaoh's administration controlled production, distribution, and consumption. It was a masterful, if brutal, piece of economic engineering. So, when you picture the Great Pyramids rising from the desert, remember that they were fueled not by grand ambition alone, but by something far more humble. They were built on a foundation of countless loaves of gritty bread and a river of thick, sour, life-sustaining beer. The taste of a wage was the taste of survival. It was the taste of a system that provided for you, but also trapped you completely. And, for the millions of people who built ancient Egypt, it was the taste of life itself, but a diet consisting only of bread and beer, while rich in calories, was not enough. To avoid disease and complete the nutritional picture, they had to turn to the other great gifts of the Nile. The life of the Egyptian peasant was tied to the great rhythmic pulse of the Nile, a cycle of flood, growth, and harvest that produced the immense quantities of grain needed for their essential bread and beer. But life cannot be sustained on carbohydrates alone. The human body needs more, and so the Black Land, the fertile gift of the river, offered another, more humble and far more pungent bounty. This was the world of the Egyptian vegetable patch, a garden dominated by a powerful, aromatic, and almost holy trinity of flavor. The ancient Egyptians saw their world in a simple, stark duality. There was Kemet, the Black Land. This was the narrow, incredibly fertile strip of dark, rich silt that flanked the Nile, deposited year after year by the annual flood. This was their entire world. It was the source of all life, all food, all civilization. It was order, and beyond it, stretching to the edges of the known world, was Deshret, the Red Land. This was the vast, lifeless, and terrifying desert. It was the realm of chaos, of dangerous beasts, and of death. A peasant's entire existence was lived on this thin, precious ribbon of black, with the red abyss of chaos always visible on the horizon. Life on this black land was governed not by 4 seasons as we know them, but by 3, each one dictated by the actions of the river. Their entire calendar, their work, their very lives were built around this powerful, unceasing cycle. The first season, beginning around July, was Akhet, the inundation. This was the great miracle. The Nile, swollen with the rains from the heart of Africa, would rise and overflow its banks, covering the entire valley in a vast, shallow, placid lake. For the farmer, this was a time of forced inactivity. The fields were underwater. No agricultural work was possible. But this was not a vacation. Forget a summer holiday. This was the season of state-enforced labor. With the agricultural workforce idled, the pharaoh's overseers would arrive to conscript thousands of men for the state's great building projects. If you've ever wondered how the pyramids were built, this was when much of the heavy lifting was done, during the flood season, when the farmers had nothing else to do but serve the God King. Then, around November, the waters would begin to recede, and the second season, Peret, the season of emergence, would begin. As the water drained away, it left behind its gift, a fresh, thick, and perfectly fertilized layer of black silt. The land was reborn. This triggered a period of frantic, intense labor. The moment the ground was firm enough to walk on, the fields would be filled with farmers from dawn until dusk. They would plow the soft, damp earth with simple wooden plows, often pulled by a pair of oxen, but just as often pulled by the farmer and his sons themselves. Immediately after, they would sow the seeds for the year's great crops, the emmer wheat and the barley. It was a race against time to get the seeds into the rich, moist earth before the sun began to bake it hard. The third and final season was Shemu, the harvest, or the season of low water. Beginning around March, this was a time of intense heat and dryness. The crops, nourished by the Nile's gift, would ripen under the scorching sun. Then came the harvest, another back-breaking task, where the entire family would work in the fields, cutting the stalks of grain with sickles, a back-breaking task. Once the grain was harvested and given over to the threshers and winnowers, the land would lie empty, cracked, and baked by the sun, waiting for the cycle to begin again, waiting for the life-giving flood to return. This cycle was the heartbeat of their world, and its predictability was seen as a reflection of Maat, the divine concept of cosmic order, truth, and balance. The pharaoh's primary job, as a living god, was to maintain Maat, and the most visible sign of that order was the annual, reliable flood. But it was a precarious balance. A flood that was a few feet too low meant that the water wouldn't reach all the fields, leading to a smaller harvest and potential famine. A flood that was a few feet too high could be a catastrophe, washing away villages and destroying dikes. For the peasant, the height of the river was a direct indicator of whether his family would eat well or starve in the coming year. His life and his diet were completely at the mercy of the river's rhythm, a rhythm that was, for him, the very will of the gods made manifest. The peasant's plate was filled with the pungent, earthy bounty of the black land. The onions, the garlic, the leeks that gave flavor to their carbohydrate-heavy diet of bread and beer. But to build the bodies required to haul limestone blocks and plow the fields, they needed a steady source of protein. While the nobles feasted on roasted oxen, the common man turned his gaze to the great, glittering, and endlessly generous heart of Egypt itself, the Nile. The river was not just their irrigator, it was their living, swinning pantry. If bread was the staff of life, then fish was the flesh of life for the average Egyptian. It was cheap, it was abundant, and it was accessible. In a society where cattle were a symbol of immense wealth and most other livestock were too valuable to eat regularly, the fish of the river were a democratic resource. They were the peasant's beef. The river was teeming with an incredible variety of life in the ancient period, before modern dams and pollution. The river was teeming with fish. Chief among these was the ubiquitous tilapia. This hardy fish, which thrived in the warm, shallow waters of the Nile, was a staple of their diet. But it was also a creature of deep religious significance. The Egyptians, ever vigilant observers of the natural world, noticed that the mother tilapia would protect her young by holding them in her mouth. They saw this protective act as a symbol of creation and spontaneous rebirth. The tilapia became associated with Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, and with the concept of regeneration. It wasn't just a fish, it was a swimming symbol of life's victory over death. Imagine a fish stick being a sacred object, and you begin to understand just how central this creature was to their worldview. Other fish were also plentiful. The massive Nile perch, a predatory giant that could grow to be larger than a man, was a prized catch that could feed an entire family for days. The whiskered catfish, a bottom dweller, was another common sight in the fisherman's net. And tomb paintings are full of vibrant scenes depicting men hauling in great nets filled with silvery, flapping mullet. The methods for catching these fish were as varied as the fish themselves. For mass catching, teams of men would work from papyrus boats, using enormous drag nets to sweep through a section of the river, their movements often coordinated by a chanting foreman. The moment of hauling the heavy, writhing net ashore was one of great excitement and communal effort. For larger prey, like the perch or a big catfish, a fisherman might go out alone on a small, light papyrus skiff into the dense marshes of the delta. Here, standing silently among the reeds, he would use a long spear or a multi-pronged harpoon to strike his prey, a contest of sharp eyes and a steady hand. This form of fishing was also depicted as a sport for noblemen, a pleasant pastime, but for the common man, it was a vital way to secure a high-value meal. The simplest and most common methods, of course, were the ones anyone could employ, a simple hook and line, or the use of woven weir baskets. These conical traps would be placed in the canals and shallow waters as the annual flood began to recede, passively trapping the fish as they were drawn back towards the main channel of the river. But the Nile, for all its generosity, was not a gentle paradise. It was a place of very real danger. The fisherman in his small, flimsy boat was a vulnerable figure. The river was infested with crocodiles, which were both feared and worshipped as the embodiment of the god Sobek. A crocodile could easily snatch a man from the riverbank or overturn a small boat. Even more dangerous were the hippos. While they may look like placid, gentle giants, they are notoriously aggressive and territorial. A hippo could crush a papyrus skiff and its occupants with a single, casual bite of its massive jaws. The catch of the day wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was a life-or-death economic activity that came with a constant risk of being eaten by something much bigger than you. So the Nile was a source of both immense bounty and immense peril. It offered up its silvery harvest, the crucial protein that kept the Egyptian people strong. But it always demanded respect, and sometimes it demanded a price in blood. For the ancient Egyptian, however, the greatest challenge wasn't just the danger of catching the fish. It was the frantic, desperate race against the hot Egyptian sun to do something with a massive catch before it all rotted away. The fisherman has braved the crocodiles and hippos and returned with a net bursting with the Nile's silvery bounty. A great cheer goes up. Tonight, the village will eat well, but this moment of triumph is also the start of a frantic, desperate race against an even more relentless enemy than the hippo, the hot Egyptian sun. The problem was not catching the fish. The problem was what to do with it before it turned into a pile of rotting, stinking poison. The moment the nets were hauled ashore, the entire community would descend into a flurry of organized, messy, and smelly activity. The fish would be dumped onto large reed mats laid out on the riverbank. Men, women, and older children would get to work with their knives made of flint or bronze. The air would fill with the sound of scraping as scales were removed, and the soft, wet sound of bellies being sliced open. Piles of fish guts and heads would grow, attracting swarms of flies and opportunistic birds. The smell, a combination of fresh river water, fish blood, and offal beginning to bake in the sun, would have been overpowering. This was the first, essential, and deeply unpleasant step in the war on rot. The most common and democratic method of preservation was to enlist the sun itself as an ally. This was sun drying, and it was a technique they had perfected. Once the fish were gutted and cleaned, they would be split open, splayed flat, to expose as much surface area as possible to the air. They would then be hung up on long ropes stretched between poles, or simply laid out on woven mats on the hot sand or a flat rooftop. Imagine the sight. Entire sections of a village transformed into a vast, glittering fish jerky factory. Thousands of fish, hanging in rows, twisting slowly in the hot, dry breeze, their silvery skin flashing in the intense sunlight. For days, they would be left to bake, the sun and the arid desert air mercilessly sucking every drop of moisture from their flesh. The process would turn a soft, flaky fish into a rock-hard, lightweight, and incredibly durable product. The final result was a piece of fish that was as dry and as tough as a piece of wood, but it was almost completely immune to spoilage. It could be stored for months, providing a vital source of protein during the flood season when fishing was difficult, or for workers and soldiers on long journeys. To eat it, you would have to break off a piece of the hard fish plank and soak it for a long time in water or beer to rehydrate it, before tossing it into the pottage pot to soften further. The flavor would have been incredibly intense, a concentrated, pungent fishiness that would have permeated any dish it was added to. Forget a delicate, fresh fillet. For most of the year, the taste of fish for the average Egyptian was the taste of dehydrated, sun-baked, and leathery protein. A more effective but more expensive method was salting. Salt was a valuable and often state-controlled commodity in ancient Egypt. The salt they used was often natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds. This was the same sacred substance used by the priests in the mummification of the dead. And the process they use on fish was in essence a form of culinary mummification. The cleaned fish would be packed into large clay jars, with thick layers of coarse salt in between. The salt would draw out the water and cure the flesh, creating a much better preserved product that was less prone to insect damage than the sun-dried variety. But it came at the cost of making the fish punishingly salty. Like the salt pork of the Middle Ages, this salt-cured fish would have to be soaked and rinsed repeatedly before it was edible. This method was likely used for higher quality fish destined for the tables of the elite, for temple offerings, or for export. For the common person, the sun was free, and so the defining flavor of their protein was not just fish, it was the taste of intense, concentrated fishiness, the taste of a creature that had been thoroughly tortured by the sun. The smell of a successful fishing village was not the fresh, clean scent of the sea. It was the overwhelming, eye-watering, and deeply pervasive stench of thousands of fish slowly desiccating in the open air. It was the smell of survival. The Nile provided a bounty of fish, a crucial source of protein for the Egyptian people. But the river was not always generous, and its bounty was not always accessible, especially during the flood season. To fill the gaps, to provide a steady, reliable source of strength, the Egyptian farmer relied on another of the Black Land's great gifts. This was the humble, powerful, and utterly essential world of the legume. If bread and beer were the carbohydrate engine of their society, then lentils, chickpeas, and beans were its protein-rich oil. They were the meat of the earth, a cheap, filling, and durable food source that formed the final, critical piece of the peasant's dietary puzzle. In a world where actual meat was a rare luxury, the legume was a daily necessity. It was the food that built the muscle that built the pyramids. The undisputed champion of the legume world was the lentil. Easy to grow in the fertile Nile soil, and even easier to dry and store, lentils were a cornerstone of the Egyptian diet for millennia. A simple, thick lentil soup, seasoned with garlic and onions, was one of the most common meals in any peasant household. It was hearty, it was filling, and it was warm. On a cool evening, a bowl of lentil pottage served with a chunk of dense barley bread was not just a meal. It was a profound comfort. These tiny, lens-shaped seeds were a nutritional powerhouse, a reliable bulwark against starvation. Alongside lentils were chickpeas, or garbanzo beans. Also easily dried and stored, they offered a different texture and a nutty flavor. They would have been added to stews, or soaked and boiled, then mashed into a simple paste to be eaten with bread. While the hummus we know today, with its tahini and lemon juice, is a later invention of the wider Middle East, the basic concept of a chickpea paste is an ancient one. And then there were fava beans, also known as broad beans. One of the oldest cultivated plants in the region, the fava bean was another vital source of protein and calories. They could be eaten fresh and green during their short season in the spring, a welcome burst of fresh flavor. But more often, they were dried for year-round use. Once dried, they became hard as stone and had to be soaked for a long time before being boiled into submission, usually as yet another component in the great, all-consuming pottage pot. The preparation of these legumes was simple and unchanging. The vast majority of them ended up in the same place, the communal cauldron, bubbling away over the hearth fire. They would be simmered for hours with a bit of grain and whatever vegetables were on hand, breaking down into a thick, savory, and nutritionally dense mush. This was the everyday reality of their plant-based diet. It wasn't a trendy lifestyle choice made for ethical reasons. It was a reality dictated by the simple fact that they could not afford a steak. But in this simple, monotonous diet, the ancient Egyptians unknowingly stumbled upon one of the most important nutritional hacks in human history. By combining grains like emmer wheat or barley in their bread and beer, with legumes like lentils or chickpeas in their pottage, they were creating a complete protein. Grains are low in a specific essential amino acid, lysine, while legumes are rich in it. Conversely, legumes are low in other amino acids that are plentiful in grains. When you eat them together, they form a perfect nutritional partnership, providing the human body with all the essential building blocks it needs to build and repair muscle. They had no concept of amino acids or nutritional science. They just knew that a meal of bread and lentil stew gave them the strength to work all day. They stumbled upon one of the most important nutritional discoveries in human history, not through science, but through poverty and a limited menu. Forget a fancy protein shake after a workout. The pyramid builders' post-workout recovery meal was a bowl of lentil mush and a jug of beer, a combination that just happened to be a perfectly balanced source of carbohydrates and complete protein. So, with the addition of legumes, the picture of the peasant's plate is complete. It was a diet founded on bread and beer, flavored with onions and garlic, and supplemented with the protein of river fish and the steady, reliable strength of the humble lentil. It was a diet perfectly adapted to their environment and their needs. It was not exciting, but it was effective. It was the simple, earthy, and protein-rich foundation that allowed a nation of farmers to build monuments that would last for eternity. Now that we understand the humble plate of the peasant, it is time to climb the social ladder and enter the vastly different world of the pharaoh's table. We have spent our time in the smoky, one-room hut of the peasant, subsisting on a monotonous but effective diet of bread, beer, and beans. We have tasted the grit in the bread and the sourness of the brew. Now it is time to leave that world behind. We are going to climb the great social pyramid, past the laborers and the artisans, past the soldiers and the scribes, until we reach the rarefied air at the very top. We are entering the world of the elite, the high priests, the powerful nobles, and the living God at the center of it all, the pharaoh. And in this world, food was not about survival. It was about theology, ritual, and a spectacular, divinely ordained abundance. Welcome to the world of the divine right to dine. The fundamental principle of the elite Egyptian diet was simple. The gods, and the pharaoh who was their son and representative on earth, deserved the very best of everything. The land of Egypt did not belong to the people who worked it. It belonged to the gods. Therefore, the finest produce from that land was owed to them as their divine right. This was not a philosophy. It was the unshakable foundation of their entire economy and social structure. To facilitate this, the great temples and the royal palaces were not just religious and administrative centers. They were massive economic engines, corporate entities of immense wealth and power. They owned vast tracts of the most fertile land in Egypt. They controlled enormous herds of cattle, flocks of geese, and sprawling vineyards. They operated their own industrial-scale bakeries, breweries, and butcheries. They were, in modern terms, fully integrated, state-run, luxury food production conglomerates. Their purpose was to transform the raw materials of the Black Land into offerings worthy of the gods. Imagine you are a nobleman or a priest. You do not eat food grown on your own small patch of dirt. You eat food that comes from the sprawling estates of your temple. Your daily meal is a direct consequence of your high position in the celestial bureaucracy. The grain for your fine, white bread was grown on the fields of the gods, harvested by temple workers and ground into the purest flour in the temple's own workshops. The ox that was slaughtered for your dinner was raised in a sacred herd, fattened on the best temple-owned pasture land. Your wine came from the pharaoh's own personal vineyards, its quality assured by a royal seal on the jar. This created a culinary system of almost unimaginable separation between the producer and the consumer. The peasant who toiled to raise the barley likely never tasted the fine beer that was brewed from it. The herder who tended to the prize-winning ox never tasted a single bite of its roasted meat. All of it flowed upwards, a great river of food, funneled from the thousands of humble hearths of the peasants into the grand kitchens of the temples and palaces. The peasant ate to fuel his labor, and his labor in turn produced the exquisite ingredients he himself would never be allowed to eat. This was not seen as an injustice. It was seen as a crucial part of maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance. The gods needed their offerings to keep the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and the world from descending into chaos. The pharaoh needed his strength to be the intermediary between the gods and humanity. The priests and nobles needed to be well fed to carry out their sacred and administrative duties. The food they ate was not a luxury. It was a necessary component of keeping the universe functioning correctly. Their fine meals were a matter of cosmic importance. This created a world where the quality of your dinner was a direct reflection of your proximity to the divine. The closer you were to the pharaoh, the better you ate. A high-ranking official would dine on roasted goose and fine wine. A provincial scribe might have a good portion of bread and a few different vegetables. A soldier would get his standard rations. And the farmer who produced it all would be at home, eating his simple pottage, hoping that the offerings being made by the priests were pleasing to the gods, because his own survival depended on it. This was the divine right to dine. It was a system that ensured the gods and their earthly representatives always ate first and always ate best. The food on a pharaoh's table wasn't just a meal. It was a testament to his power, a symbol of his control over the natural and supernatural order of the universe. It was a world away from the simple, functional fuel of the farmer. It was the taste of godhood itself. And at the heart of that taste was an ingredient that was almost a myth to the common man: meat. The diet of the Egyptian elite was a world of flavor and abundance, a universe away from the peasant's humble pottage. And nothing signified this difference more powerfully, more fundamentally, than the regular appearance of meat on the table. In a society fueled by carbohydrates, the act of eating meat was a profound statement about your place in the cosmos. It was a declaration of wealth, of power, and of proximity to the divine. And at the very top of this carnivorous pyramid, reigning supreme as the ultimate status symbol, was beef. Cattle were the walking, breathing equivalent of a luxury car in ancient Egypt. They were immensely valuable, not just for their meat, but as a source of labor for plowing the fields and as a living testament to a person's or a temple's great wealth. A large herd of cattle was a sign of immense power. Consequently, they were not slaughtered casually for a weeknight dinner. The vast majority of beef eaten by humans was first and foremost a religious sacrifice. The finest, fattest, and most unblemished ox from a temple's sacred herd would be ritually adorned, led in a procession, and slaughtered before the image of a god by specialized priests. This was a sacred act. The best cuts, particularly the hind leg or haunch, were offered to the god, placed on an altar to be spiritually consumed. Only after the god had taken his share would the physical meat revert back to the temple, where it would be distributed among the highest-ranking priests and officials. To eat beef was, in a very real sense, to share a meal with the gods. For us, a steak dinner is a nice night out. For them, it was the aftermath of a theological event. No pressure on the chef. While beef was the food of the gods and the pharaohs, the slightly less exalted members of the elite, provincial governors, high-ranking military officers, and wealthy scribes would more commonly dine on mutton and goat. Sheep and goats were easier and cheaper to raise than cattle, and while still a luxury, their meat was more accessible. Roasted lamb and kid were common features of a noble's banquet, often stewed with onions, garlic, and lentils in a way that was not entirely dissimilar to the peasant's pottage, but made infinitely richer by the presence of tender, fatty meat. But then we come to the most complicated and controversial animal on the Egyptian menu: the pig. For a long time, based on the writings of priests and the lack of pig bones in some elite tombs, Historians believe that the pig was universally considered an unclean and taboo animal in ancient Egypt. And on a certain level, it was. The pig was mythologically associated with the god Set, the violent and chaotic deity who murdered his brother Osiris. Set was said to have transformed into a great black pig to attack his rival, the sky god Horus. This gave the pig a reputation for being ritually impure and spiritually dangerous. A priest would never eat pork, nor would it ever be included in an offering to the major gods. However, the archaeological evidence tells a different story. In the excavated remains of workers' villages, like the one that housed the builders of the pyramids, vast quantities of pig bones have been found. This reveals a clear class distinction. While the priests and the pharaoh avoided the unclean animal, the common laborers who were building their tombs were eating pork regularly. It makes perfect sense. Pigs are easy to raise, they breed quickly, and they can eat almost anything. They were a cheap, efficient, and fatty source of meat for the masses. The pig, it seems, had a complicated public image. It was both a walking symbol of a malevolent chaos god and a delicious source of bacon. It was the most ideologically problematic, but practically useful animal on the farm. So the butcher's block was a clear map of the Egyptian social structure. The type of meat on your plate, if there was any at all, was an immediate and unambiguous indicator of your standing. Beef was for the gods and those who served them. Mutton and goat were for the comfortable bureaucracy, and pork was the controversial but necessary meal for the masses who could afford it. The butcher's block was not just a place for preparing food. It was a place where the rigid hierarchy of their entire civilization was carved, every single day, into every single cut. But the animals of the land were only one part of the elite's protein-rich diet. The skies and the marshes of the Nile offered another, even more varied menu. The sacred beug from a sacrificial ox was the ultimate symbol of divine favor on an elite Egyptian's table. But the carnivorous landscape they enjoyed was far more varied than that. Beyond the cattle pens and the butcher's block, the skies, the riverbanks, and the very edges of the desert offered a different, wilder menu. This was the world of the hunted feast, a testament to the incredible biodiversity of the Nile Valley and a further expression of the elite's dominion over the natural world. For the wealthy Egyptian, fowl was likely a more common sight on the dinner table than beef. The Nile Delta and its sprawling marshy wetlands were an avian paradise, a crucial stop on the great migratory routes of Africa and Europe. For much of the year, the air was thick with the sounds of geese, ducks, cranes, herons, pigeons, and quail. And the Egyptians had developed incredibly effective industrial-scale methods for harvesting this bounty. The most important bird was the goose. Geese were domesticated and raised in vast numbers on the estates of temples and noblemen. They were deliberately fattened for the table, sometimes through a process similar to modern force feeding, to produce a rich, fatty bird that was perfect for roasting. A great roasted goose, stuffed with bread and herbs, was the centerpiece of many a celebratory feast, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a Thanksgiving turkey. But the true spectacle lay in the hunting of wild birds. Tomb paintings, with their incredible detail, give us a vivid picture of how this was done. The most effective method was the clap net. This was a massive net, sometimes hundreds of feet long, that would be laid out in a V shape in a marshy clearing. A team of men would hide in the reeds, holding the ropes that controlled the two halves of the net. Another man might act as a spotter, hidden in the reeds, waiting for a large flock of ducks or geese to settle in the target area. On his signal, the team would heave on the ropes. The two halves of the net would snap shut with astonishing speed, trapping hundreds of birds at once in a chaotic, fluttering, honking mass. It was less like sport hunting and more like industrial-scale bird acquisition. For the nobleman himself, a more personal and sporting method was preferred. We often see depictions of a wealthy lord standing on a small, elegant papyrus skiff, gliding silently through the marshes. He is accompanied by his wife and children. In one hand, he holds a curved throwing stick, similar to a boomerang. With a sudden movement, he hurls the stick into a flock of birds as they erupt from the reeds, attempting to knock one or two from the air. His pet cat, often shown perched on the front of the skiff, is there to retrieve the fallen birds from the water. This was the ideal noble family outing, a pleasant boat trip that also involved a display of skill and a bit of killing. The elite's hunt was not confined to the wetlands. The desert, the red land of chaos, was also a royal sporting ground. The pharaoh and his highest nobles would ride out in light, fast-moving chariots, armed with powerful bows. Their prey was the swift and graceful game of the desert fringe, the gazelle, the antelope, and the majestic oryx. This was a high-speed chase, a test of archery and charioteering skill, with trained hunting dogs that resembled modern greyhounds running alongside to help corner the prey. This was a demonstration of control over the forces of chaos, the desert. Back in the palace kitchens, this bounty would be prepared in a variety of ways. Birds were often roasted whole on spits over an open fire. Others were plucked, gutted, and preserved in salt, just like the fish, to be used later in stews and pies. But the preparations did not stop there. The Egyptians believed that their need for food would continue in the afterlife, and so they prepared meals, not just for a single night, but for eternity. One of the most remarkable discoveries in the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun was a series of wooden boxes, shaped like the food they contained. Inside these boxes were actual, mummified food offerings, perfectly preserved for his journey in the great beyond. There were joints of beef, legs of goat, and most numerously, dozens of prepared and preserved ducks and geese, each one ready to be magically reconstituted for the pharaoh's eternal feast. It was the original takeout order for a trip that was expected to last forever. The hunted feast, it seems, was a pleasure for this life and for the next. The bounty of the hunt, the fattened goose, the noble stag, was a clear marker of elite status. But the true culinary divide was revealed not just in the ingredients, but in the very methods used to cook them. While the peasant's life was defined by the single simmering pottage pot, the kitchens of the pharaohs and priests were a world of diverse and sophisticated cooking techniques. This was the art of applying fire to the feast. The peasant's cooking was defined by boiling. It was the most fuel-efficient way to turn hard grains and tough vegetables into an edible, digestible mush. The noble's kitchen, however, was not concerned with fuel efficiency. It was concerned with flavor, texture, and status. And the highest status cooking method of all was roasting. To roast meat on an open fire was a declaration of wealth. It was, by its very nature, a wasteful process. It required a large roaring fire to be maintained for hours, consuming a great deal of precious wood. It required a piece of meat fine enough to be cooked whole, and it required manpower. In a palace kitchen, you would see a row of servants or slaves, each one tasked with the monotonous but crucial job of turning a single spit. For hours. They would sit by the intense heat, slowly rotating a haunch of beef, a whole goose, or a string of pigeons, ensuring they cooked evenly. They would use a ladle to collect the dripping fat, which would then be poured back over the meat to baste it, keeping it moist and creating a crisp, delicious skin. The smoky, savory aroma of fire-roasted meat that filled the halls of a palace was a scent the common person would rarely, if ever, experience. For tougher cuts of meat, or to create more complex dishes, the elite kitchen would turn to stewing or braising. But this was not the simple pottage of the peasants. For a start, they had better technology. Instead of simple, thick-walled clay pots that heated unevenly, a noble kitchen would be equipped with large cauldrons made of copper or bronze. These metal vessels were incredibly expensive, a sign of wealth in themselves, and they conducted heat far more efficiently, allowing for more controlled cooking. Into these cauldrons went a world of flavor. A rich stew might consist of chunks of beef or mutton, simmered for hours until meltingly tender. It would be enriched with lentils or chickpeas, flavored with the essential onions and garlic, and then elevated with a generous splash of wine or beer. The resulting dish was a thick, complex, and deeply savory concoction, a distant, aristocratic cousin of the humble peasant pottage. Baking was another technique that separated the rich from the poor. While a peasant might bake a simple flatbread in the hot ashes of their hearth, a noble household or a temple had large, dedicated, built-in clay ovens. These ovens, which looked like giant beehives, allowed for a huge variety of baking. They could produce the hundreds of conical offering loaves needed for temple rituals. But they could also be used for another culinary staple of the elite, the meat pie. The Egyptian meat pie was not quite like a modern one. The pastry case, which they called a coffin, was often a simple, thick, and very hard shell made of flour and water. Its primary purpose was not to be a delicious, flaky pastry, but to serve as an edible, disposable cooking pot. It would be filled with chopped meat, beef, fowl, or fish, often mixed with other ingredients like vegetables, eggs, or even fruit and honey, creating that characteristic Egyptian blend of sweet and savory. The pie would be baked in the oven, and the hard crust would seal in all the juices and flavors, steaming the contents within. At the table, a nobleman might break open the crust to eat the rich filling, and then discard the crust itself, perhaps giving it to the servants or the dogs. And while less common, they also practiced frying. Shallow pottery dishes would be filled with rendered animal fat or vegetable oil, and slices of meat, fish, or vegetable fritters would be fried, creating a crisp texture that was another welcome departure from the world of boiled mush. All of this was overseen by a professional staff. The head cook of a great household was a respected figure, a manager responsible for a large team of butchers, bakers, brewers, and assistants. He would be responsible for planning menus, managing the vast storerooms of ingredients, and orchestrating the complex timing of a great banquet. He was a project manager, a log keeper, and an artist. His ability to apply fire in these many different ways was what transformed the raw wealth of the land into the edible, impressive symbol of power that was the nobleman's feast. The kitchens of the noble and the priest had mastered the arts of roasting, stewing, and baking. But to truly elevate their dishes, to separate them completely from the humble fare of the masses, they reached for an arsenal of flavors that were not grown in the black soil of the Nile Valley. They reached for the exotic, for the rare, and for the incredibly expensive. This was the world of imported spices. First, we must understand that the Egyptians had their own domestic spice rack, a collection of herbs and seeds that provided the foundational flavors of their cuisine. The most important of these were cumin and coriander. Cumin, with its earthy, smoky, and slightly pungent flavor, and coriander, with its bright, citrusy, and floral notes, were the workhorses of the Egyptian kitchen. They were grown locally, they were widely available, and their flavors permeated everything from bread and stews to meat rubs. Fenugreek seeds, with their slightly bitter, maple-like aroma, were also commonly used, both as a flavoring and as a medicine. Dill, fennel, and mustard were other locally grown flavorings that added complexity to their food. This was their standard, everyday palette of flavors. But for the elite, for the pharaoh's banquet table and the offerings laid before the gods, The everyday was not enough. To truly impress, you needed to serve flavors that spoke of distant lands, of dangerous journeys, and of immense wealth. You needed imported spices. And in the ancient world, trade in these commodities was the ultimate luxury market. The most prized of these were cinnamon and its cousin, cassia. For the Egyptians, these fragrant strips of bark were the scent of mystery and prestige. They arrived in Egypt via incredibly long and treacherous trade routes, passing through the hands of countless merchants by land and by sea from their distant, almost mythical origins in Southeast Asia. The Egyptians themselves likely had no clear idea where cinnamon came from. Some stories claimed it was harvested by great birds from the secret land. This mystique only added to its value. It was astronomically expensive, a substance more precious than gold, while its primary use was in sacred incense burned in temples and in the complex process of mummification. The very wealthiest Egyptians also used it in their food. A leg of roasted beef might be rubbed with a paste of honey and cinnamon. A fine wine might be sweetened with a stick of it, creating a sweet, aromatic, and incredibly high-status beverage. To taste cinnamon was to taste the very limits of the known world. Black pepper, the king of spices, was another costly import, making the long journey from the Malabar coast of India. Its sharp, pungent heat was a novel and exciting flavor, a world away from the pungency of their native onions and garlic. A dash of ground pepper on a piece of roasted duck was a clear and unambiguous signal of the host's wealth and worldliness. The famous aromatic resins of the south, frankincense and myrrh, were also central to Egyptian culture. While their primary role was as the sacred smoke of temple rituals, their powerful, perfumed, and slightly bitter flavors were also used to infuse wine, creating a strange, resinous, and deeply sacred beverage reserved for the most important religious occasions or for the pharaoh's personal consumption. Unlike the later nobility of medieval Europe, who often used spices as a heavy-handed mask to cover the taste of meat that was beginning to spoil, the Egyptians seem to have used their spices with a bit more subtlety. With a fresher supply of meat from their own estates, their goal was not to disguise, but to enhance and to impress. The spices were a final flourish, a way of adding a layer of exotic complexity to an already high-quality ingredient. The spice cabinet of an Egyptian noble was in essence a map of their geopolitical reach. It contained the earthy flavors of their own fertile land, but also the fragrant treasures of Punt, of the Levant, and of the impossibly distant lands of the Far East. To serve a meal seasoned with these rare powders and barks was to demonstrate that your power and wealth were not confined to the valley of the Nile, but that they stretched across the entire known world. It was the taste of an empire, a flavor that was, for the 99% of the population, completely unattainable. The fine bread, the roasted goose, the beef stewed with exotic spices, and the wine from the Delta vineyards, these were the individual notes in the grand orchestra of elite Egyptian dining. But the symphony itself, the place where all these elements came together in a dazzling performance of power and pleasure, was the banquet. The banquet was not a simple meal. It was a carefully orchestrated, multi-sensory experience designed to overwhelm its guests with a vision of paradise on earth. Let us enter the great hall of a wealthy nobleman's villa on the night of a feast. The air is warm and heavy, thick with the scent of burning incense, fragrant oils, and the thousands of lotus blossoms that adorn the guests and the tables. The walls are covered in vibrant paintings depicting scenes of hunting, fishing, and offering praise to the gods. There are no large formal dining tables like the ones in a medieval castle. Instead, there are dozens of small, low tables, exquisitely carved and inlaid with ivory, arranged throughout the room. Guests, both men and women, are seated on comfortable cushions or low stools, their finest, brilliantly white linen robes, a stark contrast to the colorful decorations around them. Their necks are adorned with heavy collars of gold and semi-precious stones. Servants, quiet and efficient, move through the space. As guests arrive, they are presented with a garland of flowers to wear around their neck and a cone of perfumed wax or animal fat to be placed on top of their head or their elaborate wig. This was a unique Egyptian invention, a sort of personal, wearable air freshener. Throughout the evening, as the room warmed, this cone would slowly melt, releasing its beautiful, exotic perfume and sending fragrant, moisturizing oils trickling down over their hair and clothing. Forget a centerpiece of flowers on the table. Their centerpiece was a melting cone of perfumed fat on their own head. And then comes the food. It is not served in a sequence of courses as we would expect. Instead, it is a sudden, overwhelming flood of abundance. Servants appear bearing massive platters piled high with an almost absurd variety of dishes. The low tables groan under the weight. There are whole roasted ducks and geese, their skins crisp and glistening. There are platters of sliced, roasted beef and mutton. There are skewers of grilled quail and pigeons. There are elaborate meat pies, bowls of rich savory stews, and dozens of different types of bread and cakes in all shapes and sizes. And everywhere, there are bowls overflowing with fresh figs, dates, grapes, and pomegranates. The goal was not to provide a balanced meal, but to create a visual statement of overwhelming plenty. It was a demonstration of the host's wealth and his ability to command the great bounty of the land. The etiquette of eating was intimate and hands-on. With no forks, the primary tools were your fingers. You would use your right hand to tear off a piece of bread, using it as a scoop to pick up stew, or to take a piece of meat from the platter. The food was often pre-cut into bite-sized pieces to make this easier. Between different parts of the meal, servants would come around with bowls of water and linen towels, so you could rinse your fingers before proceeding to the next dish. We use a napkin to dab our mouths. They had a personal, mobile hand-washing station. It was a very practical solution to the logistical problems of eating a messy, sauce-laden meal with your bare hands. But a banquet was never just about the food. It was a full-blown entertainment event. In a corner of the hall, a small orchestra of musicians would be playing. You would hear the gentle, rippling notes of a harp, the sweet melody of a wooden flute, and the rhythmic beat of hand drums and clappers. And there would be dancers. Young women, graceful and often scantily clad, would perform elegant, acrobatic dances for the pleasure of the guests. The wine and beer would flow freely all night, poured by an army of servants who ensured no cup ever remained empty for long. The Egyptians were not shy about their enjoyment of alcohol, and getting drunk at a banquet was not seen as a shameful state, but as a natural consequence of a generous host. Tomb paintings sometimes depict scenes that are surprisingly candid, guests being helped from the room by servants, or even vomiting into a bowl held by an attendant. This was not meant as a criticism. On the contrary, it was likely a way of showing just how lavish and successful the host's party was. The guests had been provided with so much rich food and fine wine that they were literally, physically overwhelmed. It was the ultimate compliment to the chef and the host. The Egyptian banquet, therefore, was a world away from a quiet dinner party. It was a loud, perfumed, and indulgent celebration of life and plenty. It was designed to engage every sense: the sight of the abundant food, the sound of the music, the smell of the incense and melting perfume, and the taste of the rich food and wine. It was a performance of prosperity, a temporary, man-made paradise. But even in this world of manufactured plenty, there was one flavor, one ingredient: that was universally prized above all others for its pure, natural, and divine sweetness. The Egyptian banquet was an overwhelming assault on the senses, a performance of abundance in every way. But amidst the roasted meats and the savory stews, one flavor was prized above all others, a taste that was seen as a direct gift from the gods and a symbol of pure pleasure. This was the taste of sweetness. But in a world without sugarcane or sugar beets, the quest for sweetness was a very different affair from our own. For the ancient Egyptians, the undisputed king of all things sweet, the nectar of the gods, and the ultimate luxury was honey. It is hard for us to overstate the value and importance of honey in their world. It was their sugar, their candy, their frosting, and their most precious flavoring, all rolled into one sticky, golden substance. The Egyptians were sophisticated beekeepers, some of the first in the world to domesticate bees. They developed long, cylindrical clay hives, which they would stack in large apiaries, often under the control of a temple or a great noble estate. Honey was so valuable that it was often used as a form of tribute or tax. It was a high-status commodity, a worthy offering for a god, and a necessary ingredient in the kitchens of the pharaoh. Its divine connection was explicit. According to one myth, the sun god Ra wept, and his tears, falling upon the earth, transformed into bees. Therefore, honey was literally the tears of a god, a sacred and powerful substance. Its uses were manifold. It was the primary sweetener for the cakes and pastries of the elite. A fine wine might be sweetened with a dollop of honey to make it more palatable. It was also a key ingredient in their medicine, possessing natural antibacterial properties. It was used as a wound dressing and as a base for many medical concoctions. A spoonful of honey wasn't just a treat, it was a dose of medicine. But the most common source of sweetness for everyone was not honey, but fruit. The hot climate of Egypt was perfect for growing fruits with high sugar concentrations. The most important of these were dates. The date palm was a ubiquitous and incredibly valuable tree. Its fruit was a source of intense, concentrated sweetness. Dates were eaten fresh, but more often they were dried, which made them even sweeter and allowed them to be stored for a long time. The thick, sweet pulp of dates was also used as a common sweetener, mashed and added to breads, cakes, and even some savory dishes. Figs were another incredibly sweet and popular fruit, so much so that they were depicted constantly in tomb paintings and as funerary offerings. They were eaten fresh when in season, and also dried for year-round use. And grapes, while prized by the elite for wine, were also enjoyed by all classes as a fresh fruit, or more commonly, dried in the sun to become raisins, another durable and intensely sweet source of energy. Other fruits like the carob, with its sweet chocolate-like pulp, and the small, nutty tubers known as tiger nuts, rounded out their portfolio of natural sweeteners. So what did an Egyptian dessert look like? Forget a light, airy sponge cake or a delicate creamy mousse. Their sweet dishes were typically dense, substantial, and intensely flavored. A favorite treat was a type of sweet fritter, where a ball of dough, perhaps enriched with dates, would be fried in oil and then drenched in a thick coating of honey. Another common dessert was a form of cheesecake, made by mixing fresh cheese with honey and dates. Or there were simple cakes made from wheat or barley flour, sweetened with honey and studded with nuts and dried fruits. This was the sweet life of the ancient Egyptians. It was a world without the sharp, crystalline rush of refined sugar. Theirs was a more complex and natural sweetness, derived from the floral notes of honey and the rich, earthy flavors of dried fruits. It was a taste that was directly tied to the land, a gift from the bees in the hive and the fruit on the tree. and for a people who built their entire civilization on the savory, earthy foundation of bread and beer. This taste of sweetness was nothing short of divine. While the entire nation of Egypt, from the lowest farmer to the pharaoh himself, was sustained by the humble and nutritious power of beer, there was another, far more exclusive and far more sacred beverage, reserved for the tables of the powerful and the altars of the gods. This was a drink of luxury, of ritual, and of refined pleasure. This was this was wine. If beer was the democratic, life-sustaining bread of the masses, wine was the aristocratic blood of the gods. The division between the two drinks was a clear and potent symbol of the social pyramid. Beer was the drink of labor, of the common man, a source of calories to fuel another day's work. Wine was the drink of leisure, of the banquet, of the sophisticated elite who had the time and the wealth to appreciate its finer qualities. This exclusivity was rooted in geography. The grains needed for beer, barley, and emmer could be grown all along the fertile Nile Valley. Grapes, however, were much more temperamental. The great vineyards of ancient Egypt were concentrated almost entirely in the cooler, more humid climate of the Nile Delta, with a few smaller vineyards cultivated in the oases of the western desert. This limited production immediately made wine a rare and valuable commodity compared to the ubiquity of beer. The process of making wine was a major event, a joyful and often festive affair that is lovingly detailed in the art on tomb walls. After the grape harvest, the clusters would be brought to a large, stone-lined treading vat. A team of men, and sometimes women, would get inside and begin to crush the grapes with their bare feet, a messy, sticky, and laborious process. To keep their balance, they would often hold on to ropes that dangled from a wooden frame built above the vat. A musician playing a flute or clapping a rhythm would often accompany the work, turning the exhausting task of crushing tons of grapes into a kind of rhythmic dance. A juice or must that was pressed out would flow through spout into a smaller container, and from there it would be decanted into large clay pottery jars or amphorae. These jars were the fermentation tanks. They would be sealed with a clay stopper, but with a small hole or a piece of straw inserted to act as a vent, allowing the carbon dioxide produced during fermentation to escape without the jar exploding. After the fermentation was complete, the wine was ready. But this is where the truly remarkable sophistication of Egyptian wine culture reveals itself. They were not just producing generic red or white wine. They were ancient connoisseurs with a deep appreciation for what we would now call terroir, vintage, and provenance. When a jar of wine was finally sealed for storage or transport, it was labeled, and these were not simple labels. Inscriptions written in hieratic script on the outside of the amphorae contained an incredible amount of detail. The label would state the year of the pharaoh's reign in which the wine was made, effectively, the vintage. It would state the quality of the wine, with terms like good, very good, genuine, and even sweet. It would name the vineyard of origin, often by a specific estate name, like the House of Aton of the Western River. And sometimes, it would even name the chief vintner, the head winemaker responsible for the vintage. This is a level of detail that would make a modern sommelier nod in appreciation. They understood that a wine from one vineyard tasted different from another. They understood that one year's harvest was better than the last. They were, in essence, putting a Parker score and a detailed appellation directly on the bottle, 3,000 years before their time. The tomb of Tutankhamun, for example, was a pharaoh's personal wine cellar, stocked for eternity. Archaeologists found over 24 wine jars, and from their labels, we know that the young king had a clear preference for the vintages from the vineyards located in the far western delta. This wine was, of course, a staple of the elite banquet, but its most important role was a religious one. Wine, particularly red wine, was symbolically linked to the blood of the god Osiris, who was, among many other things, the god of wine. It was also associated with the blood of humanity's enemies, and was seen as a way to pacify wrathful goddesses like Sekhmet. It was a crucial offering in temple rituals, and was considered an essential beverage for the deceased in the afterlife. A pharaoh's tomb was not just a burial place, it was the world's oldest and best-stocked eternal wine cellar. So while the peasant drank his thick, practical beer from a simple clay cup, the nobleman would sip a fine, well-aged, and meticulously labeled wine from a delicate goblet. The beer was the taste of a daily wage. The wine was the taste of divinity, of luxury, and of eternity. The wine of the Nile Delta was the drink of the gods, a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of society. Its sophisticated production and sacred status placed it a world away from the commoner's beer. But between the two extremes of their culinary liquids, there was another essential substance, a category of fluid that was just as vital as beer, but for a much wider range of purposes than just drinking. This was the world of oil. When we think of ancient cuisine, especially that of the Mediterranean world, we immediately think of olive oil. And indeed, olive oil was known and used by the ancient Egyptians. But for them, it was an expensive, imported luxury. The olive tree is not well suited to the hot, flooded environment of the Nile Valley. While some were grown in the delta and the oases, a best olive oil was imported from the Levant, from Canaan and Syria, or from across the sea in Greece. It was a high-status commodity used in small quantities for anointing the body, as a fine lamp oil, or for flavoring the most delicate dishes in the palace kitchen. A jar of fine, clear, imported olive oil was a sign of wealth and connection. But the everyday Egyptian, who could not afford this foreign luxury, had to get their oil from other sources, and the land of Egypt provided a host of alternatives, though they were often far less appetizing. The most common and important source of edible oil was the sesame plant. Sesame seeds, pressed in a simple stone press, yielded a rich, nutty, and versatile oil that was likely the primary cooking fat for many Egyptians. It was used for frying, for dressing vegetables, and as an ingredient in bread and cakes. Another crucial, if less pleasant, source was the castor oil plant. Today, we know castor oil primarily as a powerful laxative, something you would only consume under duress. For the ancient Egyptians, it was a workhorse oil. While its purgative properties were well known and used medicinally, it was also their primary source of fuel for lighting. A simple pottery lamp, filled with castor oil and fitted with a linen wick, was the most common source of artificial light in an Egyptian home. Imagine your house being lit by the faint, sputtering glow of a lamp burning a substance you also associate with a severe stomach upset. Even more surprisingly, they derived oil from radishes. The large, hardy radishes grown in their gardens were not just eaten as a vegetable. Their seeds were harvested and pressed to create a pungent, sharp-tasting oil that was also widely used in both cooking and as a lamp fuel. But perhaps the most important oil plant of all was flax, the same plant that gave them the linen for their clothes. After the flax fibers were harvested for textiles, the seeds were pressed to produce linseed oil. Today, we use linseed oil primarily as a wood finish or in oil paints, and it is not considered safe for consumption due to the way it oxidizes. The Egyptians, however, used it for everything. It was a cooking oil, a skin moisturizer, a base for medicines, and a protective coating for wood. Their entire world was coated in a thin, versatile, and slightly varnish-scented layer of linseed oil. This multi-purpose nature of their oils is key to understanding their mindset. We live in a world of extreme specialization. We have extra virgin olive oil for salads, canola oil for frying, motor oil for our cars, and kerosene for our lamps. For them, the lines were much blurrier. The same oil might be used to fry a fish, to light your home, and to soothe a skin rash. Oil was also a fundamental part of their cosmetics and hygiene. In the hot, dry climate of Egypt, keeping the skin moisturized was a constant battle. Both men and women would regularly anoint their bodies with oil to protect their skin from the sun and the dry air. This wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of health. They would often perfume these oils with flowers or aromatic resins. To be wealthy was to smell good, to have a healthy sheen to your skin from a constant application of fine, scented oil. The poor, who had to rely on the less pleasant-smelling pastor or radish oil, would have carried a very different scent. So oil in ancient Egypt was far more than just a condiment or a cooking medium. It was a source of light, a form of medicine, a cosmetic, a preservative, and a vital part of their economy. The type of oil you used, whether it was the fine, imported oil of the olive or the common, pungent oil of the radish seed, was another clear indicator of your place in the world. It was a substance that fueled their lamps, soothed their skin, and seasoned their food, a versatile and essential liquid in the ancient Egyptians' toolkit for survival. We have explored the vast and varied ingredients of the Egyptian diet, from the divine bread and the sacred wine to the workhorse oils that fueled their lamps and seasoned their food. But where did the magic of cooking actually happen? What did the ancient Egyptian kitchen, the laboratory where these ingredients were transformed from raw bounty into a finished meal, actually look like? The answer, like everything else in their world, depended entirely on who you were. The technology of taste was not a right, it was a privilege. Let us first return to the home of the peasant. His kitchen was not a room, it was a space. It was a designated corner of the same mud brick chamber where he and his family slept, worked, and lived. The floor was packed earth. The centerpiece of this kitchen was the hearth, which was often little more than a shallow, clay-lined pit on the floor, or a slightly raised, simple clay stove with 1 or 2 openings. The fuel was whatever could be scavenged: dried reeds from the riverbank, bundles of straw left over from the harvest, and, most commonly, dried animal dung, which burned with a slow, smoky, and pungent fire. The peasant's collection of kitchen tools was meager and functional. His primary piece of food processing equipment, as we've discussed, was the saddle quern, the stone grinder that turned his grain into gritty flour and slowly destroyed the body of the woman who used it. His cookware consisted of a handful of rough, handmade pottery vessels. These low-fired clay pots were thick, heavy, and porous. They were prone to cracking from thermal shock and absorbing the flavors of every meal cooked within them, meaning that yesterday's fish stew might lend a subtle and perhaps unwelcome note to today's lentil pottage. There were no metal pots or pans here. Bronze and copper were far too valuable, reserved for weapons, tools, and the treasures of the elite. His utensils were a few carved wooden spoons and paddles for stirring, and his own personal knife. Forget a modern kitchen with its dozens of specialized appliances. The peasant's kitchen had 3 main pieces of tech: a rock, another rock, and a pot. Now, let us step into the kitchens of a great temple or a nobleman's villa. This was not a corner of a room. This was a dedicated food factory. It was often a separate complex of buildings and open-air courtyards, bustling with a large, professional staff. The difference in technology was profound. The most important distinction was the oven. While the peasant baked his simple flatbread in the ashes, a noble kitchen had at least one, and often several, large, permanent ovens. These were tall, beehive-shaped structures made of clay and brick, capable of reaching high, stable temperatures. This technology opened up a whole new world of baking, allowing for the creation of the dozens of different types of leavened breads and sweet cakes that graced the tables of the elite. The noble kitchen also had a large, open-air grilling and roasting area, a massive fire pit where servants would turn multiple spits of beef, goat, and fowl. And for their stews, they did not have to rely on fragile clay. They had massive cauldrons of beaten copper or bronze. These metal pots were not only a symbol of immense wealth, but they were also far superior for cooking, distributing heat more evenly and allowing for more controlled simmering and braising. The kitchen would also be equipped with a huge array of specialized pottery, different jars for storing wine, beer, and oil, sieves for straining sauces, and special conical molds for creating the perfectly shaped bread loaves required for offerings. This entire operation was run by a professional hierarchy. There was a head chef, or master of the cooks, who was a respected and high-ranking member of the household staff. Under him were specialized teams, bakers who knew the secrets of leavening and fermentation, butchers skilled in the ritual slaughter of animals, and brewers who managed the production of fine-quality beer and wine. It was a highly organized, efficient, and sophisticated operation. It was the ancient world's first professional food service company, and its most important client was a god. The technology of taste, therefore, was another clear marker of the social divide. The peasant's kitchen was a testament to ingenuity born of scarcity, of wringing survival from the barest of essentials. The noble's kitchen was a testament to power, a specialized factory capable of producing a vast and complex menu, the ability to control heat, to bake rather than just boil, and to use tools made of metal rather than just clay, was the true measure of culinary luxury in ancient Egypt. The kitchens of the palace and the temple have done their work. The fires have roared, the cauldrons have bubbled, and a magnificent feast has been prepared. Now comes the final and most important part of the process, the act of eating itself. But a meal in ancient Egypt, especially an elite banquet, was not a simple, casual affair. It was governed by a strict set of rules, rituals, and expectations about how a civilized person should behave at the table. First, you must picture the setting. There are no high dining tables or chairs. The Egyptians, like many ancient cultures, dined low to the ground. Guests would be seated on elegant cushions, woven mats, or low, three-legged stools, gathered around small, individual tables piled high with food. The most important guests would be given the most comfortable seats and placed closest to the host, a clear and visible representation of the social hierarchy. Now, how do you approach this mountain of roasted goose, sliced beef, bread, and fruit? You look for your cutlery. You will find a spoon, perhaps, made of wood, ivory, or for the very rich, silver, which would be useful for soups or some sauces. But you will not find a fork. The fork was an invention that would not become common for thousands of years. You will also not be given your own personal knife. While men carried knives, they were generally for utility or as weapons, not specifically for the table. The food, for the most part, would arrive from the kitchen already cut into manageable, bite-sized pieces. So what was your primary utensil? The one you were born with. You ate with your hands, specifically with your right hand. Like many cultures, the Egyptians made a distinction between the right hand, used for clean tasks like eating, and the left hand, which was considered unclean and reserved for other, less savory bodily functions. To reach for food with your left hand would have been a major social faux pas, a sign of being uncivilized. The other essential utensil was bread. A torn piece of flatbread served as a perfect edible scoop, used to pick up pieces of meat, vegetables, or to sop up a rich sauce. This hands-on approach to eating might sound unhygienic to us, but the Egyptians were deeply concerned with cleanliness, in their own way. At any formal banquet, servants would circulate continuously with ewers of water, basins, and linen towels. Between different parts of the meal, They would pour water over your hands, allowing you to rinse your fingers before proceeding to the next dish. We use a napkin to dab our mouths. They had a personal, mobile hand-washing station. It was a very practical solution to the logistical problems of eating a messy, sauce-laden meal with your bare hands. The atmosphere was not one of quiet, formal dining. A banquet was a feast for all the senses. While you ate, there would be entertainment. Musicians would play soft, pleasant music on harps, lutes, and flutes. Dancers, often young and graceful women, would perform in the center of the hall. The air would be thick with the heavy, sweet scent of incense and the lotus blossoms given to each guest. Conversation and laughter were expected. It was a joyous and lively, if structured, affair. But the Egyptians were also famous for their indulgence. They loved a good party, and a good party meant an abundance of food and especially drink. Wine and beer flowed freely, and drunkenness was not necessarily seen as a shameful state, but as a natural consequence of a generous host. Tomb paintings are famously and sometimes comically candid about this. We see depictions of banquet guests who have clearly overindulged. One famous painting shows a wealthy lady dressed in her finest linen and jewelry, leaning over and vomiting into a bowl being held for her by a servant. This was not meant as a criticism. On the contrary, it was likely a way of showing just how lavish and successful the host's party was. The guests had been provided with so much rich food and fine wine that they were literally, physically overwhelmed. It was the ultimate compliment to the chef and the host. So, the Egyptian banquet was a strange and fascinating mix of refined etiquette and profound indulgence. It was a world where you ate with your fingers but washed them after every course, where you were expected to be a polite conversationalist while also being encouraged to drink until you were sick. It was a performance of civilization and abundance, where the rules were clear, but the goal was overwhelming excess. And this deep connection between food, ritual, and the divine was never more apparent than when they were setting the table not for themselves, but for their gods. The banquets of the Egyptian nobility were grand displays of worldly power, designed to impress and overwhelm mortal guests. But there was another, even more important, and far more exclusive feast that took place every single day in the silent, incense-filled darkness of the great temples across Egypt. This was not a meal for humans, at least not at first. This was dinner time for a god. In the Egyptian worldview, the great gods like Amun-Ra, Horus, or Isis were not distant, abstract beings. They lived on earth in a very real sense. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was the god's literal house, his mansion. And the cult statue, kept in the deepest, most sacred sanctuary of the temple, was not just a symbol. It was a physical vessel that the god's spirit, or Ka, could inhabit. And like any great king living in his mansion, the god had daily needs. The statue had to be woken with hymns in the morning, ritually washed, dressed in fine linen, and adorned with jewelry. And, most importantly, it had to be fed. The entire economic engine of the temple complex was geared towards this single, crucial purpose: preparing the god's daily meals. The temple kitchens, as we've discussed, were vast and professional operations. Every morning, their staff would prepare a lavish and perfect banquet. Bakers would produce the finest, whitest bread in dozens of different ritual shapes. Butchers would slaughter a prize ox or a fattened goose, selecting the best cuts of meat. Servants would arrange piles of fresh figs, dates, and grapes on platters, and fill ceremonial vessels with the finest wine and beer. This meal was a masterpiece of the culinary arts, but it would be seen by almost no one. The high priest, having undergone ritual purification, would be the only one allowed to enter the inner sanctuary. He would carry the platters of food into the dark, smoky chamber and place them on an altar before the god statue. He would perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual where he would touch the statue's mouth with special instruments, magically allowing it to see, smell, and consume the meal. He would recite the appropriate incantations, formally presenting the food to the deity. The god would then, it was believed, mystically consume the spiritual essence of the food. It did not eat the physical substance, but it absorbed the life force, the divine energy of the offering. After a set period of time, when the god was considered to have finished his meal, the ritual was reversed. The priest would respectfully inform the god that the meal was over, and back out of the sanctuary, sealing the doors behind him. So what happened to the mountain of perfectly good physical food that was left on the altar? This is where the brilliant and practical genius of the Egyptian religious economy comes in. The food was not thrown away. Having been offered to and consumed by the god, it was now imbued with his divine blessing. It had been transformed into reverted offerings, and these sacred leftovers were now fit for the god's servants, the priests. The food was taken from the altar and distributed amongst the temple staff, according to a strict hierarchy. The high priest and his immediate family would receive the choicest cuts of roasted meat, the finest wines, and the sweetest cakes. Lesser-ranking priests would receive smaller portions of meat and good quality bread and beer. And so on down the line, with even the lowest level temple workers and scribes receiving a share. This system was a masterpiece of theological and economic engineering. The temple ran the most exclusive restaurant in Egypt, with a single, silent customer who never sent a dish back. The vast agricultural wealth of the nation, its grain, its cattle, its wine, flowed into the temples as offerings to the god. The god would consume the spirit of the food, and his priests would then consume the physical remainder. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system that made the priesthood an incredibly powerful and very well-fed class. Their piety was rewarded, quite literally, with the leftovers from a god's table. And this profound connection between food and the divine did not end when a person's life did. For the Egyptians, it was only the beginning. The daily ritual of feeding the gods was one of the central pillars of Egyptian society, a system that fused theology with a very practical economy of divine leftovers. But the Egyptian obsession with providing for the unseen did not end with the gods. It extended, with equal seriousness and incredible effort, to the dead. For in the Egyptian worldview, death was not an end. It was merely a transition, a journey to another, more permanent existence. And it was going to be a very long journey. You were going to need to pack a lunch. The ancient Egyptian tomb was not just a burial place. It was an eternal house, a magical, self-sustaining estate for the deceased spirit, or Ka, to inhabit for millions of years. And just like a living person, the Ka had needs. It required a body to inhabit, the mummy. It required magical spells for protection, the Book of the Dead, and it required food and drink for eternal sustenance. A funeral was not just about mourning the dead. It was about catering for their unending afterlife. The most basic form of this was the offering table, a stone slab placed in the tomb chapel where living relatives were expected to leave regular offerings of bread, beer, and meat for their departed ancestor. But the Egyptians were practical. They knew their descendants might forget, or that their family line might die out. A spirit could not be left to rely on the memory of the living. So, they developed a more permanent solution. They would provide a feast that would last forever. This is why the tombs of the wealthy are filled with such detailed and beautiful depictions of food. The walls of a tomb chapel are a kind of magical menu. There are scenes of cattle being butchered, of geese being roasted, of bakers pulling countless loaves from the oven. The belief was that the ka of the deceased could magically partake of these painted images, that the mere depiction of a feast was enough to sustain the spirit. They are some of the most detailed records of daily life we have, all created for the purpose of being an eternal, supernatural catering service. But they did not stop at images. They packed the tombs with the real thing, and to make it last for eternity, they would often mummify the food itself. Archaeologists, most famously in the tomb of Tutankhamun, have discovered a treasure trove of these funerary foods, packed in elegant, custom-made boxes. This was the original takeout order for a road trip that never ended. Inside these food boxes, they have found entire mummified ducks, trussed and roasted, their bodies preserved with salt and resins, looking almost ready to eat after 3,000 years. They have found joints of beef and goat, similarly preserved. They have found countless loaves of bread, now rock hard, but still in their original varied shapes. And they have found jars, dozens of them, still sealed, containing the dregs of fine wine and beer. Their labels, as we've discussed, still detailing the vintage and vineyard. They also packed the raw ingredients. There were containers filled with preserved fruits like dates and figs, baskets of dried beans and lentils, and small bags of precious spices. This was the pantry for the afterlife. The idea was to provide the deceased with everything they had enjoyed in life, so that their existence in the next world would be a perfect, unchanging continuation of their time on Earth. This practice reveals the core of the Egyptian relationship with food. Food was not just fuel for the body, it was fuel for the soul. Its essence, its life force, was something that could be consumed by spirits, both divine and human. And the ultimate display of faith and piety was to ensure that your pantry was so well stocked that it could continue to feed you for millions of years after you had stopped breathing. For us, a meal is a fleeting pleasure. For them, a meal was a permanent fixture. When you look at the offerings in a pharaoh's tomb, you are looking at the most ambitious meal prep in human history. It was a feast that transcended time, a testament to their unshakable belief that a good dinner was not just for a single night, but for all of eternity. And this deep spiritual connection to what they ate also meant that there were certain foods that, for reasons of purity and cosmic order, were strictly off the menu. The ancient Egyptians packed their tombs with an eternal feast, a testament to their belief that the pleasures and necessities of this life would continue in the next. But this divine catering came with a complex and often confusing set of rules. Not all food was created equal in the eyes of the gods. In the highly ordered and ritualistic world of ancient Egypt, what you didn't eat was often just as important as what you did. This was a culinary landscape shaped by the powerful concepts of the sacred, the profane, and the laws of ritual purity. To understand their food taboos, you must first understand their concept of ba, or ritual purity. This was a state of being that was essential for anyone wishing to approach the gods. To enter a temple, to serve as a priest, or to participate in a holy festival, you had to be clean, not just physically, but spiritually. This meant avoiding anything that was associated with the forces of chaos, death, or the untamed world that existed outside the ordered realm of Ma'at. And this avoidance extended directly to the food on your plate. This led to one of the most fascinating paradoxes of their entire food culture: the taboo against fish. As we have established, fish was the primary source of animal protein for the common person, the great bounty of the Nile that sustained the masses. Yet, for the priestly class, for the pharaoh, and in many religious contexts, fish was considered deeply impure, a forbidden food. The Greek historian Herodotus noted that priests were strictly forbidden from eating fish. and it was never present in high-status funerary offerings or on temple altars. Why was the life-sustaining food of the people considered so unclean by the gods? There are several theories. One is rooted in their core mythology. When the god Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, his body parts were scattered across Egypt. The goddess Isis managed to find all the pieces except for one, his phallus, which had been eaten by a fish in the Nile. Because of this divine desecration, all fish, or at least certain species, were seen as having a taint of sacrilege. To eat one was to partake in an ancient crime against a god. Another theory is more symbolic. Fish come from the river, a world that is murky, hidden, and untamed. They were associated with the chaos of the flood and the dangers lurking in the depths. Unlike land animals, which could be meatly butchered in a controlled, ritualized way, fish were slimy, scaly, and strange. They did not bleed in the same way. They were, in short, disorderly. And in a culture obsessed with order, anything disorderly was suspect. So, while the peasant in his hut was grateful for a belly full of tilapia, the priest in the temple would have viewed that same meal with ritual horror. An even more complicated case was that of the pig. We know from the vast number of pig bones found in workers' villages that the common people certainly ate pork. It was a cheap and efficient source of fatty meat. But for the elite and the priests, the pig was an abomination. It was the sacred animal of the god Set, the great antagonist, the embodiment of chaos and violence. The pig loved to wallow in the mud, blurring the line between the dry land and the watery underworld. It was seen as a filthy, chaotic creature. Herodotus wrote that swineherds were a shunned and ostracized caste, forbidden from even entering temples, and that any Egyptian who accidentally brushed against a pig would immediately run to the river and plunge himself in, clothes and all, to wash away the taint. Their dietary restrictions weren't about health or calories in the modern sense. They were about not accidentally eating a food that was mythologically associated with a malevolent chaos god. Yet again, a food that was a practical source of survival for the poor was a symbol of spiritual impurity for the powerful. The dietary laws for the priestly class were even stricter. To maintain their state of extreme purity, they had to adhere to a rigid diet. Beyond avoiding fish and pork, they were often forbidden from eating other foods like beans, which were thought to contain the souls of the dead. Their clothing, too, was a part of this purity. They could only wear fresh, clean linen, a plant-based fabric. Wool, being the product of a sheep, an animal, was considered impure and could not be worn in a temple. So the Egyptian menu was not just shaped by what the Nile could provide. It was shaped by a complex web of theological and magical prohibitions. The food on your plate was a direct statement about your spiritual status. To eat like a priest was to consume a diet of divine purity, one of beef, fowl, fine bread, and wine. To eat like a peasant was to sustain yourself on the chaotic and sometimes ritually unclean bounty of fish and pork. Your meal was a reflection of your place not just in society, but in the great cosmic struggle between order and chaos. We have journeyed thousands of years into the past, down the long, shimmering length of the Nile, from the farmer's muddy field to the pharaoh's golden feasting hall. We have tasted the grit in their bread and the divinity in their wine. We have explored a world where food was a currency, a medicine, a magical charm, and a sacred offering. Now, as our journey comes to its end, let us take a moment to step back and look at the entire menu of ancient Egypt. A cuisine shaped by the river, ruled by the gods, and built on a foundation of bread and beer. So after all this, what would you actually eat? The answer is a perfect reflection of their entire society, a rigid, stable, and deeply unequal pyramid. At the broad, sprawling base of this pyramid is the diet of the peasant, the farmer, the laborer. Your life is fueled by the great twin pillars of Egyptian civilization, bread and beer. Your bread is a dense, heavy, and often gritty loaf made from emmer wheat or barley, a reliable source of the carbohydrates you need for a day of hard labor. Your beer is a thick, soupy, and slightly sour porridge-like beverage that provides hydration, calories, and a host of essential vitamins. This is the foundation of every single meal. To this foundation, you add the pungent, life-giving flavor of the allium trinity: onions, garlic, and leeks. They are in everything. They are eaten raw, they are roasted, they are chopped, and thrown into the single, simmering pottage pot that defines your culinary world. And for protein, you turn to the river and the earth. You eat fish, pulled from the Nile, and often preserved against the heat by being dried into a tough, pungent jerky. And you eat legumes, a thick, hearty stew of lentils or fava beans eaten with your bread provides the reliable, plant-based protein that keeps your muscles strong. Your diet is monotonous. It is repetitive. It is a world of beige and brown, punctuated by the sharp flavors of onion and garlic. But it is also a remarkably effective and sustainable diet, perfectly adapted to your environment and providing all the core nutrients needed to build a civilization. It is the taste of survival. At the very peak of the pyramid is the diet of the elite, the pharaoh, his family, the high priests, and the great nobles. Theirs is not a world of monotony. It is a world of spectacular abundance. Their bread is not a gritty loaf of barley, but a light, soft cake made from the finest, whitest wheat, often sweetened with honey and studded with dates. Their drink is not the workman's thick beer, but fine, aged wine from the best vineyards in the Delta, its vintage and quality carefully noted on the jar. Their table groans under the weight of roasted meats. There is the sacred beef from a sacrificed ox, its fatty haunch a meal fit for a god. There is roasted goose, fattened for the occasion, along with a dozen other varieties of wild fowl trapped in the marshes. There is the thrill of wild game, like gazelle, hunted for sport in the desert. Their stews are not simple vegetable pottages, but rich, complex dishes made with tender meat, wine, and exotic imported spices like cinnamon and pepper. Flavors that speak of immense wealth and global reach. And caught between these two extremes, we find the universal truths of the Egyptian kitchen. It was a world without many of the ingredients we take for granted. A world before potatoes, tomatoes, or sugar. It was a world locked in a constant war with rot, relying on the sun and salt to preserve their food, a process that fundamentally altered its taste and texture for most of the year. It was a world where your kitchen technology, a simple clay pot, versus a professional temple bakery, defined your entire menu. And it was a world where a complex system of religious taboos and rules of purity dictated what you could and could not eat, based on your spiritual standing. The Egyptian diet, then, was a perfect mirror of their society. It was stable, it was hierarchical, and it was deeply, profoundly religious. The food on your plate was your identity card. It told the world who you were, what you did, and where you stood in the great ordered cosmos. And this entire system, from the humblest lentil in a farmer's pot to the mightiest ox on a god's altar, was oriented towards a single, grand, and all-consuming purpose: achieving a perfect, eternal balance in this life, so that the feast could continue forever in the next. And so, we come to the end of our journey along the Nile, a journey through a culinary world that is at once deeply alien and surprisingly familiar. We have seen a civilization built on a foundation of bread and beer, a people whose relationship with their food was defined by the predictable, life-giving rhythm of their great river. It was a diet of stark contrasts, the peasant's monotonous fuel versus the pharaoh's divine feast. But underlying both was a single, unifying philosophy, a concept that is perhaps the most difficult for our modern minds to grasp. It was the concept of eternity. Our modern food culture is an exhilarating and often exhausting obsession with the new. We chase new flavors, new restaurants, new superfoods, new dietary trends. Our chefs are celebrated for their innovation and their creativity. Our pantries are global, filled with ingredients from every corner of the world, available to us at any time of year. Our relationship with food is defined by novelty, by choice, and by an almost desperate pursuit of the next exciting taste. The ancient Egyptians would have found this entire philosophy to be a form of madness. Their goal was the exact opposite. They did not seek novelty, they sought stability. They did not celebrate change, they celebrated repetition. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of Ma'at, the divine concept of order, balance, truth, and cosmic harmony. The perfect world was not a world that was constantly changing. It was a world that was constant and eternal. The greatest thing the Nile did was rise to the same level at the same time every single year. The greatest thing a farmer could hope for was that this year's harvest would be exactly the same as the last. Their food was a direct reflection of this worldview. The diet of bread, beer, onions, and lentils was not exciting, but it was reliable. It was a taste of stability. It was the flavor of Ma'at. The grand banquets of the elite were not about culinary innovation. They were about a ritualized reenactment of the same divine abundance, over and over again. The greatest compliment you could give a meal was not that it was new and exciting, but that it was correct. That it was a perfect representation of the eternal order. And this obsession with eternity found its ultimate expression in their approach to death. The funerary feasts, the mummified ducks, the jars of wine and beer packed into a tomb, all of it was a testament to their unshakable belief that this life was merely a dress rehearsal for the real unending one. Their goal was to create a menu that would not change for millions of years. They were not just eating for today. They were eating for forever. As we sit here now, in our world of endless choice, of fusion cuisine and last-minute food delivery apps, it's hard not to feel a sense of profound superiority. We have refrigeration. We have global logistics. We have an understanding of nutrition they could not have dreamed of. We have, without question, a diet that is infinitely more varied, more interesting, and by our standards, more delicious. But perhaps, in gaining all of that, we have lost something too. We have lost the deep, profound connection between our food, our land, our community, and our cosmos. We have lost the sense that a simple loaf of bread is a divine symbol, that a shared jug of beer is the foundation of community. We have traded a world where every meal had meaning for a world where most meals are just fuel. And now, as this story fades, as we are left in the quiet of our own modern nights, perhaps we can take a moment to appreciate the simple stability of our own pantry, the silent, cold refrigerator, the tap that provides clean water, the bread that is free of sand. These are the quiet miracles that they could only have dreamed of. They are the legacy of a people who lived and died by the river, who built monuments to eternity, and who believed that a good meal was not just a pleasure for this life, but a necessary provision for the next. And now, it is time for our own quiet, time to sleep.